Hello and welcome to Ukraine This Week with me, Don Arleth. It's your one-stop shop to take stock of all the developments on the political and literal battlefields. Let's go ahead and get started. The International Criminal Court has issued an arrest warrant for Russia's former defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, and Chief of General Staff Valery Gerasimov. The warrants accuse both men of directing a series of missile strikes against Ukrainian electrical infrastructure, causing considerable harm to civilians.
The state of Ukraine's power grid is critical. Due to Russian missile strikes, the country has lost 70% of its generation capacity, resulting in widespread power shortages and blackouts. The International Criminal Court has raised concerns about the strikes, emphasizing that even if some installations were considered military targets, the harm to civilians and overall damage would outweigh any potential military justification. The court has found reasonable grounds to believe that Shoigu and Gerasimov intentionally caused great suffering and serious injury to the physical and mental health of Ukrainian civilians. Although Russia is not a party to the Rome Statute, and so it doesn't recognize the ICC's jurisdiction, the court noted that public awareness of these warrants might contribute to the prevention of further crimes. Last year, the ICC issued arrest warrants for Vladimir Putin and Russia Commissioner for Children's Rights Maria Lvova-Belova for unlawful deportation of children from Ukraine.
As the election season in the United States heats up, two top advisors to former U.S. President Donald Trump have proposed a plan according to which military aid to Ukraine would cease unless the country agreed to hold peace talks and negotiations with Russia. The plan also limits ceasefire terms and a warning to Russia that the U.S. would resume military support if Russia were to refuse to accept the terms.
In November, President Joe Biden and former President Donald Trump will run against each other in the U.S. presidential election, which is shaping up to be a divisive and closely fought contest. Throughout his campaign, Trump has repeatedly claimed that he would end the war in Ukraine within 24 hours if elected.
Before I even arrive at the Oval Office, shortly after we win the presidency, we win, all of us together are going to win, I will have the horrible war between Russia and Ukraine settled. I know them both. I will get it settled.
However, the former president has so far kept the specifics of this plan under wraps. Now Keith Kellogg and Fred Flates, who previously served on the National Security Council in the Trump administration, say the proposed ceasefire would freeze the front lines in their current positions, a scenario Ukraine is not keen on accepting.
To freeze the war at the current front lines where the active fighting is taking place would be strange, as it is Russia that is in Ukrainian territory. It is Russia that has violated international law, and freezing the war at the current front lines will not stop the war as such, it will prolong it.
Trump campaign spokesperson Stephen Chung, however, has emphasized that only statements coming directly from Trump or the campaign should be taken as official policy guidelines.
Russian President Vladimir Putin and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un have signed a new partnership agreement during a summit held in Pyongyang. The agreement, which pledges mutual aid if either country faces aggression, marks the strongest connection between these two nations since the end of the Cold War.
Vladimir Putin's visit to North Korea was marked by grand ceremonies and public displays of friendship. The summit, which saw Putin visiting the country for the first time in 24 years, came amid escalating tensions with the West and Moscow's growing isolation. While details of the deal were not immediately clear, both leaders described the agreement as a major upgrade in their relations. In reality, the new defense pact signed between Russia and North Korea publicly laid out Moscow's willingness to engage in full-fledged military cooperation with Pyongyang, a move which South Korea perceives as a direct threat.
Any direct or indirect assistance or cooperation that enhances North Korea's military capability is a clear violation of the multiple UN Security Council resolutions.
The deal has raised concerns among all Western nations, particularly regarding an arms agreement where North Korea will supply Russia with munitions for its ongoing conflict in Ukraine.
The deepening cooperation between Russia and the DPRK is something that should be of concern, especially to anyone that's interested in maintaining peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula, but also supporting the people of Ukraine as they continue to fight against Russian aggression.
The deal doesn't mention the current war, and there is no immediate indication as yet that North Korea will send troops. But Pyongyang does plan to send its military engineering unit to the occupied territories of Ukraine to undertake rebuilding work.
The Czech Republic has successfully delivered the first 50,000 artillery shells to Ukraine as part of a significant military aid initiative, the Ammunition Coalition. This delivery marks the beginning of a larger effort to supply Ukraine with up to 500,000 rounds by the end of the year, and even more after that.
Czech Prime Minister Peter Fiala confirmed that the first batch of shells had arrived in Ukraine some time ago, emphasizing the country's commitment to supporting Ukraine in its struggle. The initiative is part of a broader international effort with contributions from several countries, including Germany, Denmark, Portugal, Canada, and the Netherlands.
Must support them as much as possible, as much as we can, and do it on our own as Czechs, but also do it internationally, because it's not the task for one country, it's the task for many countries.
The initiative, led by Prague and supported by Germany, aims to bolster Ukraine's defense capabilities amid ongoing conflict. The Czech government has allocated over $34 million for this effort, with the shells being procured from the Czech ammunition producer STV Group. The delivery comes at a crucial time, as Ukraine faces significant challenges on the front lines. The initiative is expected to provide a steady supply of ammunition, potentially delivering up to 100,000 large-caliber shells per month.
And finally, it's time for a quick news flash of all the other stories rounded up from this past week.
Russia continues targeting Ukrainian energy infrastructure with drones and missiles. Kharkiv, Ukraine's second-largest city, experiences the most attacks, causing many deaths and injuries among its residents. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said last month that Ukraine would need 7 more Patriot missile systems to fend off Russian attacks. The European Union has officially opened accession negotiations with Moldova. Moldova has to contend with a frozen conflict and Russian peacekeepers on its territory. But by beginning the talks, the EU is signaling that Moldova is on a path taking them away from Russian influence and towards greater integration with the West.
I reiterate.
Starting from July, Ukraine will start receiving revenue payments from Russian frozen assets. This was announced by the European Union's top diplomat Joseph Borrell, who said the money will be transferred in 2 tranches. Kyiv is expected to receive 3 billion euros each year for reconstruction and defense needs. Russia blames Washington for the Ukrainian attack on Sevastopol with US-supplied Atacam missiles. The attack killed 4 civilians and injured 150 other people as missile debris fell on a beach nearby. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov called the strike barbaric and accused the US of killing Russian children.
And now let's take a look at the front lines in Ukraine to look at the latest developments over the last week. Now, actually, this week, there's not all that much to report as far as movements go along the front lines. Intense fighting continues in many areas, and of course, Russians continue to push in those normal directions that we've been looking at over the last few weeks. Now, what is reportable here is if we go ahead and look at the situation up in the Kharkiv region, of course, the border area along with Russia, Vovchansk, and around the area of Lipsy. No further Russian movements into Ukrainian territory. It seems that Ukrainians have been able to push the Russians back quite a bit, but some units have dug in and continue to occupy lands just beyond the border in Ukrainian territory. The good news is that the A lot of weapons have arrived in Ukraine. Artillery shells don't seem to be lacking at the current moment. So this will allow Ukrainians to defend the territory there in the Kharkiv region. And they're also, of course, hitting back and having the weapons with which to do that. One thing to report in the Kharkiv region is the area around Kupiansk. And I believe it is up near Sinkivka. The Russians, I don't know if we have this on the map, but the Russians are pushing a little bit to the south and to the west there, and they're trying to encircle Sinkivka from a different direction, although just small gains have been reported. If we look at the situation down near Chasiv Yar, and this is all, of course, according to the Institute for the Study of War, the one notable movement, I guess we can say, that has been observed since June 18th is the situation near Toretsk. Now, Toretsk is between Chasiv Yar and the Avdiivka front, Novoalexandrivka. I always have such a difficult time with that. But in Toretsk, the Institute for the Study of War says the Russians have committed forces there, although they are making no spectacular or significant gains. Toretsk is important because, again, they can work their way towards that road that connects Pokrovsk together with Konstantinivka. And, of course, they are also looking to encroach upon that road from the Novoalexandrivka direction. Novoalexandrivka is still a contested city. There are no confirmations that the Russians have taken it. And, of course, the Ukrainians are going to try to prevent at all costs from that happening. So indeed that they do not give Russians too big of an advantage to be able to start to have fire control over the road there connecting those two important cities of Pokrovsk and Konstantinivka. Well, that's it for this wrap up of the front lines, and let's go ahead and move on. And now we'd just like to leave you with a few images from the capital of Ukraine, Kyiv, during wartime. Take a look. And now it's time to look at the war in Ukraine through the humanitarian lens. Joining me today is Michael Capponi, founder and president of the Global Empowerment Mission, or GEM, which has been instrumental in providing humanitarian aid to Ukraine since the first days of the war. According to the UN cluster report, the food programs of Global Empowerment Mission, together with the Howard G. Buffett Foundation, have provided over 40% of all food donated to Ukraine. Well, hello, Michael, and thank you for joining me on Ukraine this week.
Thank you for having me.
Now, Michael, you've just traveled all along the front lines in Ukraine, over 3,600 kilometers, completing over 30 missions. Tell us where you went and what were the most affected areas that you saw?
Well, as you stated earlier, which is very correct, we first went out into the Kharkiv front lines, furthest villages that weren't occupied. And it was a lot more calm than we anticipated, actually. We were actually there a month prior, and it was much worse. So there was definitely a change that you could see in the atmosphere there, and more of a comfort, and the will is back in the people there. Donetsk was pretty heavy. Zaporizhia, at the time that I was there, was by far the heaviest. And then we were in Kherson also. So we did that whole, stretch where we have different mission leads, basically managing those areas. The need is gigantic, as you know. So there's no power, there's no electricity, there's no resources, really. There's not much they can do unless you bring them supplies. And this is a very important thing. That's why we do it.
Yeah, now, what were your biggest overall impressions about the humanitarian situation and in general, the war at this stage? I mean, you've been there dozens of times. You've seen the war progress over the last couple of years. So what are your thoughts this time around after your last trip?
I feared that the locals living in those villages would just have so much fatigue that they were just ready to throw in the towel. And so I kept asking them, obviously through a translator, we kept asking them, are you still proud to be Ukrainian? What do you think of this war? And they just basically want peace. They want it to stop. But they all said, we were born Ukrainian and we will die Ukrainian, and we will never give up our land. So it's important that that's still what's in their heads.
Yeah, it is. It is important, and it's very, I guess, sobering in some ways to see that, despite all the hardships, that sentiment persists. Now, it's been a little bit.
You got to imagine that these are people that have been in a basement for over 2 years. Imagine, where their entire neighborhood is basically rubble, and they're living underground with no power, no electricity. We just bring them boxes every 2 weeks, and they still have that will. That should tell you all you need to know.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Well, on that note, as far as destruction, I mean, you've seen destruction all over the country. Was there one place in particular on this trip that stuck out in your mind that was completely devastated? Something new to you?
Unfortunately, these, tactics on, basically, I guess the mentality on the other side is, if I can't have it, I'll just level it, right? And there's just so much unnecessary destruction of civilian infrastructure. And, if you drove that, stretch that we did and you looked at all that destruction, you would not understand how that relates to a war. These aren't military targets. These are just villages, homes, shopping centers. It's just basically, there's no purpose in doing this other than with one motive, which is basically to make everybody leave.
Right, and terrorize the population. It's been a little over a year since the Russians blew up the Kovka Dam. You also traveled down there. What was it like 1 year on?
Yeah, you and I were on a boat together.
That's right.
Floating over people's homes, unfortunately. The morale is great. It's much better, despite it all. There's still not much water there, so we still deliver millions and millions of liters of water to that whole region, which is also, without that, I don't think they'd be able to, survive really. But life goes on. Like I said, everybody is still just as, determined to get through this.
Yeah, in it to win, it seems. Now, Michael, the amount of humanitarian aid that you and the Howard G. Buffett Foundation deliver to Ukraine is more than impressive. I think everybody would take their hat off to that. Now, tell us and our viewers how your operations have changed and progressed over the war, and in what ways have you innovated your system to address the constantly changing, as we've seen, the humanitarian needs and situation?
Yeah, so the first main thing that we did is in the beginning, let's just say the first 6 months of the war, everything that we brought to Ukraine was imported. So you're buying it at a higher value in the United States, or you're buying it in Poland, and then you have a lot of transport costs and you're bringing it in, and it's not really doing anything for the economy of Ukraine in any way, which it desperately needs, of course, right? So we started a farm to frontline initiative. We basically partnered with a consortium of farmers, created 2,000 jobs, and we grow all that food now, which is basically custom packaged for GEM and Howard G. Buffett Foundation. And that not only creates all these jobs, right, which keep moving, right? So the money is continually changing hands, right? It goes to the farmers, and then the farmers get to eat and support each other's families. Then it goes to the truck drivers and the packagers, right? Everybody is benefiting. The people we hire are actually IDPs, right? They're internally displaced people that now have jobs. So it's like a little micro economy in a way by doing empowerment projects like this. That's why our name is Global Empowerment. So we're able to get a box of, say, 17 kilos of food, right? A big box that's very heavy for about 2.5 people. We're able to get that from the farm to the front line for about $17 a box. And when you look at the other systems that are out there from much bigger organizations, their costs aren't that low, right? Because they're importing things and they're just doing it in a lot less efficient manner. So how to get the most amount of aid for the least amount of money to the most amount of people, that's really our motto. And that's why we have these systems. And so that's the first thing we do. And the second main thing we do is windows, because every day there's bombs that blow out windows. And we've replaced about 150,000 windows, believe it or not, already, which is a lot of windows. And you got to think that that's about 80,000 people, pretty much, right? 2 windows an apartment, 1 to 2 people per apartment. And if you don't replace that window, those people immediately are going to go over and become either internally displaced people at a very high cost to the Ukrainian government, or they're going to go into Poland, or they're going to go into Europe or America. Either way, it's going to cost a lot more than the price of replacing a window to keep them in their homes, which is what they want to do anyways. So that's our 2 main programs. And then we repair all different kinds of projects that we've done, from construction. We've repaired over 300 different structures. So, and then we have also our generator program with the Howard G. Buffett Foundation. So that, as you know, power and energy is, been attacked over 50%. You've talked about this many times on your show. Over 50% of the, energy infrastructure has been destroyed in Ukraine. So we bring in large generators, over 1,000 of them that we've distributed and installed already. Some are gigantic. They're as big as an 18-wheeler truck. They could power entire hospitals, clinics, everything, schools. So yeah, from a humanitarian perspective, our job is to, find the greatest need and address it in the simplest, most scalable, and financially efficient way possible.
Well, Michael, I say this, you're doing God's work. Keep up the good work. It was a pleasure to have you on this week, and thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you.
The Biden administration is reportedly nearing a decision to lift the de facto ban on deploying American military contractors to Ukraine. This move aims to assist Ukrainian forces in maintaining and repairing U.S.-supplied weaponry, and very special weaponry at that.
Since the full-scale Russian invasion in February 2022, the U.S. has refrained from having any military presence in Ukraine. Consequently, damaged U.S. military equipment has had to be transported to NATO countries like Poland and Romania for repairs, a process that has proven time-consuming. But that might soon change. The potential policy shift comes in response to ongoing Russian advances and delays in military aid. If approved, this would mark the first time since 2022 that the Pentagon could attract American companies to provide on-ground support in Ukraine. This could include the maintenance of critical systems such as the F-16 fighter jets, which are expected to require regular servicing once operational in Ukraine. The country is expected to start using F-16 fighter jets this summer. After facing delays in delivery and extensive training for pilots and the ground staff, the Netherlands has confirmed that Ukraine should receive its first batch of F-16s soon. The arrival of F-16s is eagerly anticipated, as it represents a major upgrade in Ukraine's Air Force. Ukraine has been waiting for months to start using the fighter jets and hopes their introduction will change the dynamics of the war, forcing Russia to adopt more conservative tactics in its attacks on areas closer to the border. Some voices say that first target of Ukrainian F-16s could be Kharkiv area, where Russia has been extensively deploying its own fighter jets. Experts, however, suggest that the Ukrainian military might face challenges operating F-16s. The US is supposedly delaying the training of Ukrainian pilots on the aircraft, and their current skills are not optimal. Additionally, maintaining this aircraft will demand a well-trained crew and qualified specialists.
And now, joining me to discuss is Jon Sweet, retired military intelligence officer.
Hi, Don. Thanks for having me back on your show.
Yeah, great to see you. Thanks for joining us again this week. I've got a couple great topics for you, and well, I'd love to get your insight. So, F-16s, they're on their way. They may be already there. But what do we know so far as how Ukraine will use the F-16s? And what capabilities do you think that they're going to give the armed forces of Ukraine?
Well, first of all, I think we take a look at what Ukraine's doing now in the absence of the F-16s, and that is setting conditions for their arrival on the battlefield. They're taking out Russian S-300s, S-400s, and as of this morning, a lot of chatter on Twitter today about the one S-500 that was deployed to Crimea. So they're setting conditions for those F-16s, opening up air corridors for those F-16s to provide close air support to ground forces, also interdict Russian forces deeper into Ukraine, but also into Russia, and provide close air support and air cover within Ukraine for the soldiers in the fight positions.
Now, concerning the rules of engagement, as you understand them currently, what can the Ukrainians do? What can they not do with the F-16s?
Well, I'm not sure about the F-16s. I haven't heard the rules of engagement. I understand the rules of engagement is obviously for the ATACMS is targets of opportunity within 100 kilometers, but not beyond 100 kilometers. I don't believe that we'll see the F-16s go into Russian airspace. I believe the F-16s will, if they're using a close air support or a deep strike, will release their munitions prior to going over Russian airspace. So I don't think that's the intent. The intent is to provide close air support on the ground, but also set conditions, which is interdiction of Russian forces.
Now, I've heard that Ukraine must use these aircraft very wisely without risking them too much. Do you agree with that sort of assessment, and explain?
Sure. So it's a limited amount of resources. So it's not like they have 200 F-16s coming to them. They have a smaller number. So they have to be diligent in the use. They don't want to put them in high-risk scenarios. That said, Ukraine has been very adaptive and innovative in the way in which they use Western weapons. So I'm sure they will find a way to incorporate the F-16 into their arsenal of options and use it effectively against the Russian forces.
Now, just for a little bit of context, looking at the counteroffensive that we saw last summer, where they got various armed vehicles and tanks and a lot of weaponry, and they tried to launch that counteroffensive. Do you believe they took on too much risk? What was the reason for the failure of that counteroffensive? Did they take on too much risk, or were the Russians just dug in too well and too well prepared while the Ukrainians were waiting for those weapons?
That's a tricky question. So first, the offensive should have been based on a combined arms capability, and one of the arms that they did not have is probably the most important, which is the air aspect. So they didn't have the jets or the helicopters to provide that close air support. The other reason, as you just mentioned, is I don't think that neither neither Ukraine or NATO realized the depth and the complexity of the Russian defenses, the time in which they had to establish first, second, and third level defense lines. So maneuverability was severely restricted due to the minefields and interlocking fires and the depth of artillery that was on the battlefield. So if they're going to do this again, they'll have to take out the artillery, the counter battery, and they'll have to go after those air assets.
Now, will this be a big test for the F-16 against Russian aircraft? Has anything like this ever been seen before?
Not the scale we're about to see it. Yeah, of course it's going to be a test. It's the first time that we're going to see F-16s in air-to-air engagements, possibly with Russian aircraft, but also going into airspace, denied airspace. So there's going to test the limits of the particular airframe. Now, there's multiple variants of that airframe that are being introduced, and it also comes down to the competency of the pilots. But again, I'm confident in Ukraine's ability to bring this weapon system into their arsenal and then to use it in ways that the West hadn't envisioned. They've been very effective in doing that with other platforms. Take, for instance, the Patriot, by maneuvering the Patriot forward and causing what we call SAM ambushes. They've been very effective in shooting down aircraft in addition to missiles. So they'll find a way to bring it into their system.
Yes. Now, concerning the service and maintenance, are foreign contractors, in your opinion, the best option to deploy, to be able to deploy the F-16 as quickly as possible?
It is an option. At the end of the day, it's still U.S. personnel on the ground, whether they're military or contractors. So there'll have to be some type of defense mechanism to protect the airfields where these contractors will be working from. So there's been a lot of discussion recently about 8 additional Patriot batteries arriving into Ukraine to provide that level of security. But it'll have to be a dedicated effort to put an umbrella up to protect those contractors. Now, what it will also do is it will speed the time in which the airframes and other types of equipment, not just for the Air Force, but other types of equipment to get them back on the battlefield when they've been damaged.
From a, I guess, legal point of view, what is the difference between a member of the military and a contractor, a U.S. contractor?
Well, from the Russian perspective, they're going to be combatant. Okay. From a legal perspective, I can't break that out for you. You'll need a lawyer that's better served in that area.
Well, the Russian perspective is what I'm interested. Do you think it's escalatory to put contractors on the ground in Ukraine?
I think they'll become a target. I think that Russia will actively target them. And look, it's no different than from the Russian perspective. They're talking about putting a North Korean engineering unit into the Donetsk region to help rebuild. So is Ukraine going to target them? So it brings a new complexity to the battlefield. Now we'll have, other than the two warring factions, we'll actually have government-sponsored or provided non-combatants on the battlefield. So it changes the complexity a lot.
Certainly interesting to see how this is developing now. Bear with me. We've got another quick report here. Russia is showing signs to prepare and revise its nuclear doctrine. Since the invasion of Ukraine, Moscow's rhetoric surrounding its nuclear arsenal has become much more aggressive. Let's go ahead and take a look at this next piece.
Okay.
Russian President Vladimir Putin's remarks during his recent state visit to Vietnam sparked speculation about the country's nuclear weapons doctrine. During a press conference summarizing his visit to North Korea and Vietnam, Putin spoke to reporters about possibly re-evaluating Russia's stance on nuclear weapons, raising concerns about the threshold for their use. Russia's nuclear doctrine was most recently updated in 2020 and currently allows for the use of nuclear weapons in 4 cases. The first is in response to a nuclear strike against Russia. The second is in response to the detection of the launching of such a strike even before enemy nukes arrive. The third concerns a conventional strike against infrastructure needed to conduct a nuclear strike, such as long-range radars or command centers. The fourth and most vague case involves conventional aggression against the Russian Federation, which would put the state's very existence in danger. Earlier comments by Putin suggested he wanted to lower the threshold for the use of nuclear weapons, possibly aiming to water down the fourth condition for employing nuclear weapons. The Russian leader also referred to the alleged development of more tactical nuclear warheads by Western nations as a threat. Recently, Russia and Belarus carried out joint nuclear drills. Officially, the drills were aimed at ensuring that the two countries' military personnel and equipment were ready to protect Russia's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Many observers note, however, that those drills can be perceived as a show of force. Russia owns one of the biggest arsenals of tactical warheads in the world. But some analysts suggest that since the country's nuclear infrastructure hasn't been modernized in years, its effectiveness could be questionable. Putin kicked off a modernization program for the country's Soviet-era nuclear arsenal in recent years. However, the ongoing war in Ukraine is putting a strain on Russia's military budget, and weapon systems not used directly in the conflict are likely to be sidelined.
Okay, Jon, so Vladimir Putin's been nuclear saber rattling for quite some time, and so far this is just a statement. But Putin says that the nuclear doctrine needs to be readapted to current realities. So what do you understand this could mean?
Well, to me, this is pure messaging from President Putin. And it comes at a time, Mark Toth and I recently wrote an article for the Daily Mail in which we talked about the use of escalation, nuclear escalation. It is designed to affect an audience. In this case, the audience is the Biden administration and also NATO. The thought is that they continue to threaten nuclear escalation, that the U.S. will put more restrictions or constraints on Ukraine and their ability to use ATACMS or F-16s. I believe that Putin realizes he's reached his high watermark. He's not going to be able to advance any further in Ukraine. And now he's looking for some type of rationale to bring the war to a conclusion, to negotiate an end state, and to retain the territory that he has captured. So I think that all plays into that particular mix. It's trying to bring that escalation paralysis back into the equation and to force the West to make concessions in exchange for not ratcheting up the nuclear rhetoric.
Recently, on May 22nd, Ukraine launched a drone attack on 2 Russian strategic nuclear early warning radars at Armavir. Some have said that this is pointless strategically for Ukraine to do, and it creates a much more dangerous scenario when it comes to the use of nuclear weapons. What are your thoughts on this? Is it in everyone's interest that Russian capability to detect an incoming nuclear strike not be impeded?
Well, you assume that there's not a secondary use for that particular radar also. Its primary use probably is for early warning for nuclear weapons, so I respect that. There are probably other targets, other high-value targets that Ukraine could be focusing on as opposed to further antagonizing Russia. But there could be secondary reasons why they went after those targets, and you'd have to, I guess, reach into the Ukrainian military to find out what the primary role was of taking out those radars.
Right. I don't think I'd get an answer on that one. But changing gears a bit, if we look at recent Russian bilateral ties, not only is it isolated, but it seems to be actively building stronger partnerships and creating an axis with Iran, North Korea, China to counter the West. Is this something that we should be concerned about? Is this something that we should be worried about, taking active precautions? What are your thoughts?
Well, those partnerships were present before the war occurred. What's changed now is the movement of weapons, material, and in some cases personnel. When I say personnel, Russia going into those countries and actively recruiting fighters to come to Ukraine to fight for them, and not just in those 4 countries. They've recruited in Africa, they've recruited in Cuba, and portions of Central America. So
India.
The relationships were there before, but they're stronger now, obviously, to some degree. And don't misunderstand that China's not benefiting from this economically. In exchange for cheaper oil and energy, they're providing some types of material to Russia. So it's always been, as Mark Toff and I would say, an arsenals of evil that Russia's been able to reach back into to sustain their military operations.
Now, China is supporting Russia in the worst war on the European continent since World War II, yet many European leaders still go about their dealings with China as business as usual. Now, are these two things not detrimentally interconnected or intertwined? And based on your analysis, are the European leaders going to, at some point, at least recognize and respond to this threat?
Well, unfortunately, China is a technology hub. China is also, as far as labor costs, is significantly reduced, and it's hard for the West in order to keep prices down. It's hard for the West to turn against that. But I think Western leaders are starting to understand and starting to realize that by continuing to put that money into the Chinese coffers, that China is in sense reinvesting that money into Russia. So eventually decisions will have to be made. And it can't just be individual nations. It will have to be a united effort between the EU, NATO, United States, and our Asian Pacific partners also. But no, it is helping fund the war effort to some degree. And let's recall that everything's interrelated. I mean, we're talking those relationships, so let's talk about BRICS and how that's affecting the outcome too. So it's all connected.
Yes, and now finally, before we run out of time here, I'd like to just get your thoughts on the upcoming NATO summit. Any big hopes or expectations we should keep our eyes peeled for?
I think the big hopes would be some sort of announcement on just what the requirements are and the timelines are going to be for Ukraine to be brought into NATO. The other piece will be to the effect of what type of weapon systems are going to be provided to help them win, and then a strategy to actually accomplish that mission.
Well, do you think that the strategic goal needs to be set? I mean, doesn't Ukraine need to set a strategic goal, and doesn't the West need to also kind of at least garner a consensus around a strategic goal so that we can start taking proactive steps to accomplish that goal?
I certainly agree that the two sides has to take their strategic goals and bring them into one. Right now, they're operating on different sheets of music. One side's trying to win the war, another side's kind of half in to win the war. One side desperately, and I don't know if desperately is the right word for it, but is aggressively pursuing membership into NATO in the EU, while the other side is hesitant to bring them in as opposed to further antagonize Russia. But there has to be a message that's projected to Russia that says, at the end of the day, we support Ukraine. We're going to support them winning the war, not invading Russia, but pushing Russia out of the country and then bringing them into the family of democratic nations.
Yep, well, we'll be following this closely, very closely. Jon Sweet, retired military intelligence official, thank you very much for joining us today on Ukraine This Week. Appreciate your thoughts and analysis.
Hey, thanks again, Don.
And that's all the time we have on the program. Thanks for joining us, and be sure to tune in again next week. See you next time.